They took her coat off as if it were an unnecessary ornament. It was raining hard enough that the glass over the foyer blurred the city lights into smeared gold. The hall of the Halvorsen house smelled of lemon polish and a faint, nervous perfume Veronica favored for dinner parties. Veronica's hand was steady when she folded the thin gray cardigan and set it on a polished console. Her face was steady too, the kind of steady people practice in mirrors to make the world believe in their certainties. Margaret stood with a small brown bag in one hand. The bag had been patched countless times with black tape. A tiny wooden cross, worn smooth by her fingers, dangled from the strap. Her cardigan clung to her shoulders, and rain gathered at the hem of her skirt like a dark halo. She looked at Gabriel as if asking permission. He looked at Veronica as if asking counsel. Neither answered her. "Get out," Veronica said. She did not shout. She had no need to. Her voice was flat, and in that flatness the order sharpened. "Tonight, leave now. We can't have her here." Words like knives can be polite and still cut. Gabriel cleared his throat and practiced a smile that was more apology than defense. Margaret's mouth formed a small, private expression, half surprise, half sorrow, the kind that had come to her before in other rooms, in other houses years ago. She turned her face to the rain as if to ask the weather for permission to go. Outside, the city was a smudge of neon and the hurried footfall of people who did not see the small dramas happening in foyers like this. She picked up her bag. The strap dug into her palm where the black tape had rubbed a raw edge. Veronica's hand hovered, then withdrew. Clara, Veronica's friend who had been visiting that evening, said nothing. People like Clara have cultivated silence into an art form. Its language is the pleased nod between those who believe they belong to a neat, untroubled world. A few neighbors watched through the tall windows, the curtains parting like small black birds that meant to return to their perches. No one stepped forward. Gabriel's foot moved as if to block her, and then he let it rest. Reputation has weight. So does a wedding photograph on a mantelpiece. So does a new suit pressing the lines of a man's decision into the shapes he will carry the rest of his life. Margaret opened the door. The rain hit her face without consideration. She walked down the stone steps with hands steady, as she always had been, and the house receded behind her like a thing she had served but never owned. The wooden cross at her throat tapped her sternum like a metronome. Her fingers closed for a moment around its edges. She had a small private prayer, one she had kept in her mouth for decades, offering the world to God in fragments, and returning to it sharpened for the next day's cleaning, the next pot left in the sink, the next tea to be made. If this story touches something in you, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who believes dignity should never be put out in the rain. She crossed the sidewalk slowly, shoulders hunched not from cold, but from the shape of being a woman who had spent years removing other people's marks from furniture and faces. The doorman, who had been trained to look away at the right moments, closed the door behind her with a politeness that felt like a dismissal. Her shoes were thin, the pavement pooled at their seams. At the corner, a taxi pulled away and she waited for another. The light changed. A bus hissed by. Margaret walked in the direction of the old neighborhood, the place of low-slung houses with chipped paint and trees that had known children for generations. People who had lived there for a long time saw her and nodded. There are economies of attention in small neighborhoods. The nods are currency. She kept the black taped bag close, as always, because it held more than a few garments. It held a Bible with the spine taped, a folded photograph of a small boy with a gap between his teeth and papers that were never useless to her, a faded school receipt, a small scrap from some time when the world owed less, and she owed more. At a bus stop under a flickering lamp, a young man in a hoodie muttered a phrase that might once have been a polite question. "You okay, ma'am?" It was enough. She smiled in a way that had years of practice in it, soft, patient, truthful. "I'll be fine," she said. "Thank you." The rain was a drum the whole way. It would later become the story's image. The night a family thought it could throw away a life, the night the weather baptized a reckoning. But in those first moments, it was only rain, impartial and loud. Margaret walked until the familiar lines of the faded yellow house appeared. Pale sun-bleached planks, the front stoop with its patched railing, an old ceramic bowl by the door that always held a small pile of smooth stones. The house had been her first home after leaving a childhood that was thinner than many lives. Foam mattress, threadbare curtains, a mother who hummed to candles. But it was hers in the only way that matters to some people. Memory made solid. She stepped inside, leaned her shoulder against the door, and closed out the rain. Inside there was the smell of boiled tea, and the fixture on the ceiling hummed like an old friend. Margaret's movements were small and careful as she unbuttoned her wet shoes, dried the tape on her bag with a kitchen towel, and set the wooden cross on the table beside the Bible. She rinsed her cardigan and hung it in the hall. She made 2 cups of tea because that was what she did. Before prayer, she always made tea. Before sleep, she always kept ritual. There was a particular comfort in the way the kettle released steam, as if the house were exhaling with her. That night, when the city had more rain than heat, Margaret slept in a chair, her feet tucked under the quilt. She woke early and made tea for the man whose name would always sound like a bell in her chest. Gabriel. He was the boy in the photograph with the gap in his front tooth, the one who had climbed over fences and read with his nose pressed to words while she stitched shoes and listened to the radio with a careful, secret hunger. She had watched him with such fierce quiet that her hope for him had the shape of a lit candle. She had worked for the Halvorsens for years, first for sustenance, then for a kind of belonging absent from her own name. And she had given him everything the house allowed her to give. From the beginning, she had chosen sacrifice like an apron, to be worn and cleaned and folded away. She had never thought it shameful. She had thought it necessary. The foam mattress where Gabriel slept as a child had been an accommodation, thin, resilient, lined with the same kind of endurance that showed up in her hands. She had patched his shirts, ironed the collars, whispered instruction not as discipline but as the currency of survival. When the acceptance letter to university arrived, she had cried in the kitchen not because of the cost, but because the boy she had raised would leave the square cold of their neighborhood and enter a world wearing shoes of different polish. Gabriel's ascent was textbook in one way: scholarship, a city internship, a relentless optimism that looked like ambition. He learned to make his sentences shorter and straighter for meetings, to remove any softness from a pitch. People rewarded him with contracts and praise, then with contracts that paid for better suits, then with a partnership in a firm whose offices smelled of cedar and new money. His hands changed. They lost the small, quick tenderness of washing dishes and acquired the architecture of signings and handshakes. He married Veronica, who was as precise as a trimmed hedge and who had a way of arranging parties so that every guest felt noticed for their own worth and slightly less than hers. The first arguments between mother and son were gentle as rain at first, mismatched. Veronica criticized the towels for being the wrong color, the curtains for being off in a way that was more about the aesthetics of a life than any real function. Margaret answered each criticism with the instrument she knew best: work. She washed and replaced, folded and ironed, sewed and smoothed. She stayed invisible, and that invisibility began to feel like a paid position in the household. To be unseen was to be useful. There were other slights that hurt more because of their smallness. Veronica would speak above her in the kitchen, instructing staff through phrases that would be softer if spoken to a peer, but were edged when said to a woman who had raised the bridegroom on bread and patience. At dinner parties, Veronica's eyes hovered like a comb over the room, and then landed on Margaret with the exact surgical tilt of discernment. "Could you just," she would say, and someone else would take the tray. Margaret would accept the excuse as if the tray were a test she had never been told about. Gabriel watched. Often he did not speak. He had learned a new grammar for the world: silence when decisions were being made, and a soft smile when compliments were offered. He had traded a kind of fierce loyalty for a quieter, more convenient one, loyalty to an image he wanted to maintain. If someone suggested that his mother's hands were wrong for the house he was building, he learned to second that suggestion in ways that felt defensible. He would come home tired, and Margaret would be there, kettle steaming, the same wooden cross at rest on the table. There were flickers of the old love, 2 teacups, a leftover joke, but they became rarer. like a bird that visits a feeder less often. Veronica was not carved of villainy. In her youth she had been hungry for belonging too, but she had learned that belonging requires a kind of presentation, the right furniture, the right friends, the right quiet that tells the world you have arrived. Her life before Gabriel had been a shaping force that taught her to edit even affection. Clara complimented her on the quality of her curtains. Clara complimented Veronica in ways that made Gabriel's chest tighten with a recognition he didn't quite allow himself to voice. "We must put her in a place," Clara murmured once over coffee, anthropological curiosity beneath the cup. "It's not charitable to keep the wrong image at home." Small things accreted into a pressure that could be mistaken for inevitability. A dress left on a chair becomes a stain on the wallpaper of a marriage. A phrase spoken in a soft room can become a decree. Veronica began to create a life where every object was deliberate. The staff were taught to retreat into service like a theater's crew, useful when seen, invisible when finished. Gabriel, who had been raised by hands that could fix a leaky tap and mend a torn seam, learned that power was about the right choices and the right company. He began to practice both as a ritual. The night they asked Margaret to leave, she had been, by her reckoning, doing the job she had done for years. She had folded napkins for a party she was not invited to attend. She had polished a mirror Veronica ordered be hung in the guest room. She had tucked a blanket into a drawer where Veronica believed linens should live. She had made tea for two, as she always did, with a quiet prayer that the man she loved would be kinder. The exchange in the foyer folded those years into a single sentence. The house, which had accepted her hands and repaid them with the shelter of a room and the illusion of family, would accept those hands no longer. When the taxi did not come and the bus route overflowed its schedule, Margaret kept walking. The rain made a small canopy over her hair and collected at the lower hem of her skirt. The streetlights made her wet hair look like silver thread. A security guard named Luis, who did rounds at night for the apartment building near the corner, saw her fall into the gutter with a thud that sounded like a small private failure. He called out, but she did not move. He crossed the street. Up close he saw the outline of her face, water on her eyelashes, the small cross at her throat. His hand found her wrist, and she did not pull away. She smelled faintly of lemon polish and something older, stew, tea, the quiet of a life spent mending. Luis dialed emergency services with the simple procedural calm of someone who had seen how quickly weather turns a person's fortunes. When the ambulance arrived, the EMTs spoke to one another in clipped tones. Gabriel called from the Halvorsen house in a voice that fractured when the reality of the hospital bell sounded in the middle of his day. "She was out in the rain," he said, and the world inside that one sentence was a story he had not yet allowed himself to read. At St. Agnes Hospital, the rooms smelled of bleach and hope. The clinical light flattened faces until their features read like pages of a familiar book. Margaret was wheeled into the emergency department on a stretcher with a blanket tucked around her knees. Her pulse was a quiet drum, her breathing small and measured. Dr. Sandra Mills, a woman with a face the city entrusted with its frailness, came to the bedside and listened to the monotone machines as if to music. She examined the small wooden cross, the black taped bag, the Bible with its spine taped back again. Hospital rooms are repositories of people's lives in midshift. Sometimes the smallest objects tell the biggest stories. Gabriel arrived like a man who had lost a map. He stood at the head of the bed, and the room compressed to the space between their shoulders. The guilt that had been a background noise in his life sharpened into a present that pressed the back of his throat. "I'm so sorry," he said. And its sound was not enough. Margaret's lips moved but did not form words. Her eyelids fluttered with a prayer, perhaps, a habitual recitation that had no need of language. Gabriel squeezed her hand, and for the first time that night his hands, once taught to sign contracts and clasp applause, felt like instruments he did not know how to play. The doctors were careful. There were no melodramatic pronouncements, just processes born from training and rules, scans, blood work, a patient history that came together like patchwork. Dr. Mills took a breath and said the things families find terrible because they are true. "She's stabilized for now. We'll admit her for observation. We need to understand why she was exposed to the elements for so long." She was asked to leave. Gabriel said. The confession arrived like a stone sinking. Veronica had been quiet at home. Clara had gone to another party. The staff had been instructed to tidy and be invisible. There was a time when Gabriel would have felt only the immediate ache of seeing his mother in a hospital bed. Now the question of culpability could not be removed from the ache. He sat in the visitor chair with his head in his hands and let the thin curtain between them go down and up like a soft shutter. In the hours that followed, Margaret slept under hospital light. The machines breathed for her in small, regular intervals. There is a kind of hush around a hospital night that is almost sacred. The hush of lives held in quiet jeopardy, while other lives move on in plastic, fluorescent rhythm. Gabriel did not leave. He drank vending machine coffee that tasted like resin and regret. He watched the cross on the bedside table and traced with his eye the grooves made by years of fingernails. Something in Margaret's bag caught an orderly's eye when she went for the blanket that had been folded too neatly and tucked at the foot of the stretcher. The black-taped bag had been placed under the gurney. When the orderly, a woman named Mrs. Peters who had worked in different wards long enough to have a memory shelf of small human things, lifted the bag, a small envelope fell out. It was older than the black tape and had the kind of paper that remembers hands. The flap bore a faded seal and a name written in a looping hand. Margaret Hayes. Mrs. Peters, who kept an eye for history in hospital pockets, slid the envelope into her pocket with an odd reverence. She had been a social worker once and knew the language of documents. Later, in the corridor outside the room, when the night had thinned into a small, cautious dawn, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice and a photograph tucked against it like a secret. The photograph showed a man in a dark suit and a young woman holding a baby whose face had a small, familiar gap between the teeth. The same gap Gabriel had. The paper was not a will in the legalistic form everyone imagines. It was closer to a solicitor's letter with edged paper and a seal that read, Halvorsen and Corridors Solicitors. The letter named Margaret Ruth Hayes and referred to a testamentary note attached to the estate of Edmund Halvorsen, dated 3 decades prior, which detailed an instruction from the deceased to settle certain properties and make provision for a long-term housekeeper, and her line should certain contingencies arise. It referenced a sealed affidavit and an attached codicil to be produced upon proof of identity. There were names, dates, and an old postmark. There was, most tellingly, an instruction that the solicitor should hold in trust the evidence and particulars of any issue of the said Margaret Hayes. Mrs. Peters did not act on it immediately. She did not phone anyone because the hospital demanded discretion, and because documents like these can be fragile and must be handled by those who understand how paper becomes law. She folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it in the side pocket of the bag. Her breath fogged the window pane as she considered what it might mean. The veil between the house where Gabriel lived and the fate of a small, weathered woman had become thinner by the width of a piece of paper. When she told Gabriel, his face did not at first register what she said. "There's a letter," she told him, and words fell like marbles, circling a drain. The photograph slid across the visitor's table until it rested against his knuckles. The baby in the picture looked like him. The black-taped bag against his mother's chair looked like the geometry of a life folded small. He called an attorney, an acquaintance in the firm where he had made a name, and there was a calendar of formalities to be followed. But a name followed closely by dates is a thing that presses at a person's sense of reality. Gabriel found himself unable to shelve the possibility that the past had a legal shape he had never been taught to read. Veronica, when told, reacted in a manner that was equal parts incredulous and private panic. The mansion's pedigree was not only a matter of deed and tile, but of a social narrative that defined her life and gave it value. If Margaret were related to the Halvorsens by blood, then the tidy certainties Veronica had built would be dust under a broom. She looked at Gabriel with a new calculation in her eyes, one that was fast and precise and a little afraid. She considered what news like this would do for the invitations stacked in her drawer. The hospital became, for a time, a room of colliding worlds. Gabriel stood between the life that had given him ordinary shelter, his mother's hands and her quiet, and the life he had assembled with Veronica, which required a certain kind of curated history. He thought of the photograph again, and his memory provided 100 small, half-forgotten scenes that took on new shades. The way Margaret had always known the right note to bring him back from a bruise to a bruise-free calm. The school plays where she had sat in the back and clapped, as if applause could sew the seams of his future. Margaret woke with the slow, measured awareness of someone emerging from long water. Her eyes found Gabriel's first, and he felt the burn of shame like heat on the back of his neck. She did not accuse. There was in her look something like the weather, clear, honest, a kind of mercy. She reached for his hand and held it as if to say nothing now could be undone except with the small care of the days to come. At her bedside, the photograph and the letter sat between them like a quiet instrument waiting to be played. Gabriel and Dr. Mills discussed the processes necessary: verification of identity, contact with the Halvorsen estate lawyers, a registry search to confirm any recorded codicils. Dr. Mills was not an estate attorney, but she was used to the way lives and papers intermingle in hospitals. "These things can take time," she said, "but it's important to handle them carefully. If there is a legal instrument, we'll need an attorney with experience in estates. You should speak to yours." Gabriel's attorney spoke in measured, careful sentences that felt like masks for time. "We need to verify chain of title," the lawyer said over a late-night call. "We need to check Halvorsen & Co.'s archives, confirm the postmarks, and determine whether any codicil was filed with the probate registry. We cannot act hastily, but we should gather evidence now." There was a legal choreography implied in the lawyer's words. A set of steps that would require patience, forms, and the slow domestic reality of courts and papers. It would not be instant. It would not make headlines in a single breath. It would require work. When Veronica heard this, she turned a color that surprised even her. Pride, which had once been a shelter, felt suddenly like a barricade to be dismantled or rebuilt. She began to consider restitution in the abstract, her mind drafting apologies that were as composed as she wished her life to appear. There was a moment, not yet comfortable or public, in which she placed both hands on Gabriel's shoulders and whispered, "We will do what's right." Whether she meant it as a real promise or as a statement of posture, no one could say. For the first time she looked at Margaret as if the woman were not simply a shadow, but a person with claims. Margaret, when she could speak, offered a small confession that complicated the neat legal path for everyone. "I didn't tell you," she said to Gabriel the day she was well enough for short visits. "I was ashamed. It is complicated." She had not pursued a claim because claiming would have required a narrative she was not prepared to tell, and because the quietness of the life she had chosen felt like a protection for Gabriel. He had built a life that she did not wish to undo for the sake of a paper that asked more questions than answers. Why make your child carry discomfort in the name of what you might be owed? Why complicate the man you loved? Margaret's humility was not a failure. It was a philosophy. "Why would you think you needed to protect me?" Gabriel asked, and the word protect felt hollow and heavy in the sterile light of the hospital corridor. For all the years he had been lauded and advanced, he had never considered that mercy could be strategic in this quiet way. He felt a new tenderness, slender and frightening, toward the woman who, for him, had been both mother and maid, friend and servant. The photograph in the envelope became a hinge around which the household's history might swing. It raised questions that were at once intimate and institutional. Had Margaret been the daughter of Edwin Halvorsen, or one of his descendants? Had someone in the family, decades ago, quietly attempted to provide for her? The possible legal avenues proliferated like tiny roots: a will, a codicil, a sealed affidavit waiting to be unsealed in the probate office if the right fingers requested it. But legal documents are not automatic in their operation. The solicitor's firm might have closed. Records might be misfiled. The Halvorsen estate could be held in trust, or the papers might be part of a private collection in a lawyer's desk that no one had opened for years. The revelation that a simple bag contained such a document was less like a strike of lightning than like a seed germinating in unexpectedly fertile soil. It asked for tending, not spectacle. Meanwhile, the household felt the first tremors of change. Veronica began to receive texts that were polite and sharp. Clara sent a message asking if everything was all right. Invitations were considered with a new calculation. The staff murmured to one another about the turning of fortunes. Gabriel's life, a life whose edges had been crisp and carefully manicured, now had a raggedness he could not easily smooth. Margaret, at the center of the slow storm, returned to the small rituals that had always defined her. Morning tea, the quiet prayer that was not for spectacle, and the way she wrapped a bandage on a blister as if it were a sacred task. Her dignity did not change in the face of uncertainty. It merely became more visible, like wood that has been polished by hands and now gleams without fuss. As the hospital prepared to discharge her into a slow convalescence, Dr. Mills placed her hand on Gabriel's shoulder. "Take your time," she said. "Healing isn't just physical." It was a clinical sentence and a compassionate one. Gabriel nodded as if the word time could be purchased. He began to imagine days that looked different, mornings with 2 cups of tea, the implicit routine returning like an offering. He imagined conversations with Veronica that would be harder than any deal he had signed. He imagined an attorney's office, the smell of paper and ink, and the patient, precise work of proving what a photograph suggested. Outside, in the rain-washed city, the Halvorsen mansion stood like a thing awaiting judgment. People would call it a house, a home, a symbol of accomplished status. Margaret's bag, with its taped seams and the wooden cross that had seen the worst of her life, would bind her to that mansion in ways that were legal and moral. The revelation of a hidden connection was not a vindication in a single flourish. It was a beginning, and beginnings ask for time. In the quiet hours, Gabriel walked the length of the Halvorsen corridor that connected his and Veronica's rooms. He touched the banister where his father once leaned, a faint memory lodged in varnished wood. He thought of the small, accumulating slights against his mother. Not one, but many. He thought of Veronica's voice the night of the exile, cool as a blade. He thought of how easily he had moved from making promises to keeping aesthetics. The house itself seemed to wait. At the threshold of change, there is always a moment of decision. To move forward with contrition and repair, or to return to the previous state with its protective illusions. Gabriel stood there and let the weight of his mother's hand settle in his palm, a small, real force. He could already imagine lawyers and registrars. He could imagine headlines he did not want. He could imagine Veronica's worst fears and her best attempts at apology. But he did not yet know what the law would say. The solicitor's letter was a doorway, not an answer. The provenance of the photograph and the exact legal wording in the codicil would have to be verified. There would be forms, signatures, waiting. And if the claim had merit, there would be processes, paperwork, possible negotiation, the public airing of family history that Veronica would find unbearable. The possibility of Margaret being an heir implied a rearrangement of the house's meaning, not necessarily its immediate ownership. It could compel a moral reckoning long before any legal one. As dawn moved toward morning, Gabriel returned to the room where his mother slept and sat beside her. She opened her eyes and smiled in a way that was not surprised by the news, only tender toward the messiness of life. "We will be fine," she said quietly, in a voice that had mended shirts and patched hearts. She did not claim restitution. She only asked for care. Outside, the rain hushed into a patient mist. The mansion remained, its windows catching light like careful eyes. Inside, a family that believed itself secure had been offered a small, unyielding truth. Dignity is not a thing a house can bestow, and the life you dismiss at your door may hold the proof of a history you have not earned. There was a telephone call in the early hours, a solicitor's assistant leaving a message that records could be scattered, that a probate clerk would need to be consulted, that there were archives worth searching. Legal processes were, by design, slow and exacting. For now, the letter lay in Gabriel's pocket like a coin that might buy nothing or might buy everything. He pressed it and felt for the first time in years the weight of a decision he could no longer postpone. Veronica stood in the hallway and watched him from the threshold, watching a man whose moral center had shifted like tectonic plates. She had read the solicitor's note and catalogued the possible outcomes with the efficiency of someone who had learned to measure calamity in terms of guest lists and property lines. She told herself she would do the right thing. Whether she meant it or only performed it, the sound of her breath grew quieter. Mrs. Peters, who had found the envelope, folded her hands and left it at the nurse's station with a small note. Keep with patient. No one there could predict the legal storms that might follow. They only knew that a woman with a patched bag and a wooden cross had been offered a small, improbable doorway back into a house that had once been part of her story, in ways no one had noticed. Night softened into day as the city assumed its usual pace. The mansion's windows reflected a world that had not yet adjusted to what might come. Gabriel sat with his mother and watched the steam curl from 2 mugs of tea. He did not yet speak of courtrooms or deeds. He only watched his mother breathe and felt the shape of a life he would not let go of again, even if the law took its time to confirm the photograph in the envelope. Outside the room, a registrar's office awaited. Not yet alerted, not yet engaged. The machinery of verification ready to be set in motion by a person with a file folder and a story. The house, in its slow, ostentatious way, remained a building of bricks and varnish. But between its walls and in the small brown bag patched with black tape, a hint of something else, history, claim, human stubbornness, had lodged itself like a seed in winter soil. The coming days would require choices. Reparations would have to be considered. Words would need to be said that could not be easily taken back. People would choose whether to apologize with sincerity or to perform apology as a public act. The law would move slowly, the family would not, and the woman with the wooden cross would recover, watched by hands that had finally learned what they had the power to protect. The envelope rested in Gabriel's pocket like a compass he had spent years refusing to carry. He slid his fingers inside and felt the thinness of paper between his knuckles. The world of the mansion was quiet, but not quite certain. The proof was present, but not yet public. What it would mean, whether the property would change hands, whether privileges would be rearranged into apologies and small restitutions, remained to be established with the patient work of lawyers and registrars and stubborn human decency. For now, the most urgent work was simple and small: to sit with his mother, to make her 2 cups of tea in the morning, and to let his hands remember how to be gentle. He could not fix what had been done by a single decision in a foyer in the rain. He could only begin to make right the sequence of small actions that had led to it. He thought of the foam mattress and the old yellow house, and of the days when promises were traded for future toil. He promised himself that the small rituals would return: tea with sugar for her, a voice lowered in apology, untidy hands that would reach for a bowl and stir. Beyond the hospital windows, the city was beginning to wake. There would be phone calls and documents to track, and a legal path that would unfurl in a direction the family had not expected. For now, in the soft fluorescent light, Margaret slept and Gabriel watched, and the brown envelope with its looping hand waited, patient as a truth that is finally ready to be heard. The solicitor's assistant had said, gently and with that peculiar mixture of formality and human caution that belongs to people who carry other people's histories, that things like this were rarely clean. "We will need time to verify," she'd said, "but there is a trail, we will follow it." Time arrived as a thin, steady thing. Appointments, signatures, phone calls that sounded like wood being sanded down. Patient, persistent, shaping the surface until it could be handled. Gabriel learned the language of records. He sat in a high-backed chair at Halvorsen & Co., a firm whose leather smelled faintly of old paper and the kind of patience that had seen estates settled and tempers cooled. The partner, Mr. Aldridge, who had a face like a ledger and the kind of eyes that read people as though they were paragraphs, spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had read wills enough to know how often human lives hide in footnotes. "The letter found in Mrs. Hayes's bag," Mr. Aldridge said, "references a codicil and an affidavit to be produced upon proof of identity. We will need to inspect the Halvorsen archives and cross-reference probate registry entries. If there is indeed a sealed affidavit, and if it affirms the relationship it claims, that will substantially change the estate's obligations." Gabriel listened as if the words were rain on a roof. Necessary sound, carrying water, but not yet the shelter he longed for. He felt no triumph, only a slow, building dread at the thought of what might be revealed in public, and an even deeper fear that his own passivity had helped make this possible. He thought of the foyer that night, of his mother's cross tapping her sternum in the rain. He thought of Veronica's thin smile, of her careful hands folding a sweater into a rectangle that meant belonging. The search turned up a file with more dust than clarity. In a room with a single small window, an archivist named Elena worked with the kind of concentration that made her a map of small movements. She came back with a folder whose edges had been softened by time and fingers. Inside was a codicil, attached to Edmund Halvorsen's will, sealed and bearing a notation that it should be produced if the matter of Margaret Ruth Hayes be duly questioned. There was also, folded within, a separate affidavit sworn decades earlier by a woman named Agnes Reed, then a nurse or housekeeper in the Halvorsen household. Her handwriting was cramped and sure. "I remember them," Elena said later, over coffee that tasted like strong, necessary things. Not the people so much as the habit of keeping secrets in that house. This firm held many of their papers. Sometimes archives keep the past because no one knew what to do with it. The affidavit was short and blunt in its tenderness. Agnes Reed testified that Edmund Halvorsen had fathered a daughter with a woman who had worked in the house and that, under the pressure of scandal and the desire to protect both the child and the Halvorsen name, arrangements had been made for the child's care. Edmund's instruction, she wrote, had been to make provision for the child and her descendants should they ever present themselves with proof of identity. The codicil specified properties to be held in trust pending confirmation. It is one thing to see a name on a page. It is another to watch a human life widen to fit that name. Gabriel found himself holding the photograph from Margaret's bag, the small boy with the gap in his teeth, and feeling the world tilt. The legal explanation had a crispness to it that comforted the intellect but unsettled the heart. "If the codicil is valid," Mr. Aldridge said, "it places certain obligations on the estate trustees. There are routes. Petition the probate registry to unseal and enter the codicil into the record. If the affidavit is considered credible and identifies the claimant, then the trustees must account for the terms set out. It does not instantly place deeds in a hand, but it does change who is to be considered when the estate's distribution is determined." Veronica learned a new grammar of fear in those days. Her messages slowed. Invitations dried up. Clara called twice and left a message that sounded like a duck skimming water, pleasant on the surface, anxiety below. She gathered herself as if preparing for a storm she had not expected to weather without a hat. "We must be careful," she said finally, when she could speak face to face. "There is procedure. There is discretion. We can manage this." Her hands fluttered over a silk scarf, as if smoothing creases could smooth life itself. Gabriel did not want to manage anything to the exclusion of truth. He found that truth had a voice peculiar to it, small and sometimes shocking, not always loud enough to shake the ceilings, but present in the way Margaret still folded tea towels with the same ritual precision, and in the quiet of her prayers. He chose the awkward, slower route. He instructed his lawyers to begin the formal process of verification and to do it transparently. He would not hide the fact that a woman who had been his mother in every meaningful way might, by blood, also be a Halvorsen. Legal verification expanded like the careful spreading of a map. A search at the probate registry uncovered a dated entry. A sealed codicil filed with the will, annotated by a registrar who had written, "Affidavit attached. Produce upon inquiry with satisfactory identity proof." Copies of family ledgers revealed entries of payments made to a nurse and to a woman for board and custody, entries that matched the timing of Margaret's early years. In the Halvorsen household account books, an entry read in the clean hand of a steward, "For the care of the infant. Expenses to be held on instruction of E. Halvorsen." The steward's name was signed with a hand that had curled like a question mark. The old steward, a man named Anders who had retired to a small house with curtains that never matched, Came to the solicitor's office because once you have served a family for years, you carry a loyalty that outlives paychecks. He was frail in the way that time makes people economical with movement, but his memory was precise. Edmund was a man who regretted what he did not do early in life, Anders said, his voice threaded with a northern accent and a kind of remorse that had nothing to do with law. He set things in motion. He did not want his mistakes to break someone else. He was the sort who would rather pay quietly than cause noise. It was his way. He produced, with a little shame and a little steadiness, a scrap of paper, an expense ledger, the ink faded to the color of old tea. There was an entry that matched. Payment for guardian to Margaret Hayes, arranged by E. Halvorsen. All of this made sense in the domestic way of things. Lives arranged by those with money, moved like furniture. It also made a legal case. The affidavit, the codicil, the ledgers, the photograph, each was a thread. Together they made a rope capable of pulling the story into public view. When the probate office unsealed the codicil and read it aloud, it did not sound like a verdict. It sounded like an intention that had waited for the proper weather. The codicil described properties to be set aside and said explicitly that, should any issue of Margaret Ruth Hayes prove their identity, they shall receive such provision as was intended by the testator. The lawyers explained the practicalities in sterile phrases: chain of title, estate trustees' duties, the need for formal identification. A DNA test might be requested by a trustee to confirm biological relationship, but Mr. Aldridge suggested that the affidavit and documentary chain already held considerable evidentiary weight. Gabriel could have demanded more. He could have insisted on a DNA test to blunt gossip, or to confirm in a clinical way what the document suggested. The idea of reducing a woman's life to a sample in a vial felt ugly to him. Margaret, who had watched him in the hospital with eyes that forgave but did not obfuscate, preempted the choice with a quiet that had the ring of a small command. "If they ask for proof," she said one afternoon while they sat in the convalescent room, "I will give what they need, but we should not make a show of it. It has never been my wish to make trouble. Only to be treated as a woman who belongs, not a problem to be hidden." Her dignity set the terms. Gabriel understood that what he had to do was less about creating drama and more about offering repair. He returned to Veronica and told her, with a steadiness he was still learning, that he would preserve the family's reputation only insofar as it did not require the erasure of truth. He would not litigate for show. He would pursue the codicil with the aim of honoring the intention of the man who had written it, and of securing a future for the woman who had been his anchor. Veronica listened as if to a foreign language. For a while she stood where she often stood in the house, at the threshold between private and public, arranging gestures like frames. "What will it mean?" she asked, every social calculation packed into a single small question. "Will the house be ours? Will people say we've been living in the wrong place?" Gabriel met her eyes. "It will mean," he said, "that we have to be honest, that we put dignity before display. If the law confirms the documents, then we will act accordingly." That accordingly became a series of practical meetings. Trustees were called. The Halvorsen family lawyer, a man with a face like a folded paper bag of manners, presented options. The property could be transferred directly if the trustees, bound by the codicil and evidentiary corroboration, agreed that Margaret or her issue met the test. If not, litigation could be pursued and a court would adjudicate. Litigation would make every small detail public. It would injure people who were already vulnerable. The trustees, when they realized the moral contours of the matter and the weight of evidence, preferred a quieter arrangement, a voluntary conveyance, subject to certain conditions and confirmations, that would give Margaret an enforceable legal interest, while allowing the family to maintain their home in a way that preserved dignity rather than spectacle. None of this occurred in a single hour. There were drafts and counter-signatures. There were evenings when Veronica paced, and nights when Gabriel sat across from his mother and simply held her hand. He had not become a different man in a single day. He had become one who saw, and in seeing, could not easily return to the habit of not seeing. Margaret returned to the Halvorsen house not as a woman seeking to claim a conquest, but as a person accepting an offer of help she had not expected and did not wish to weaponize. The first time she walked through the front door after the hospital, the house seemed to recognize her. A blanket folded at the foot of a chair, the kettle placed like a prayer. The banister where she had once steadied a small, clumsy boy now bore the imprint of the hands of the man who had once been cradled. Veronica met her at the foyer with a small, careful expression on her face. There were apologies, stumbling, real, human apologies, that had to be said. "I'm sorry," Veronica said, and the words left a residue of humility that surprised both of them. "For the way She broke off and gathered herself. "I thought image would give us safety. I was wrong. I am sorry." Margaret's hands were not large, but they had the architecture of an entire homemaking. She took Veronica's fingers for a moment, not to forgive like a flood, but to acknowledge that the possibility of repair required something steady. "Thank you," Margaret said. "Thank you for saying it, that matters." Her voice was not a sentence of absolution. It was a bridge, small but usable. Negotiations among lawyers moved like a tide. Not a sudden crash, but a steady, inevitable change. The trustees agreed, upon the production of the affidavit, the photograph, and ledger evidence, to a voluntary conveyance that would create for Margaret a life estate in the property and an equitable interest to be determined by final probate. In plain terms, she would have a legal right to live and be secure in the mansion for the remainder of her life, with trustees arranging for certain portions to be set aside for her and for a fund dedicated to domestic staff in the city. If the probate ultimately confirmed broader inheritance rights to her issue, the trustees pledged to honor the codicil's language in good faith. There were legal forms, checklists, and the city registrar's ink. Margaret signed with a hand that had folded many things, laundry, letters, hopes, into order. She did not relish the formality. She accepted it as a practical brace. She signed with the steady stroke of someone who knows what a signature can do, and does not suppose it a crown. When the conveyance was registered, there was no parade. There was, instead, a small meeting in Gabriel's study, with tea served in the old china, 2 cups arranged by gesture more than ceremony. Gabriel poured. His hands, once trained to the press of a handshake across a deal, now trembled only from the effort to be present. "We will do the right thing," he told his mother. He did not speak of restitution as spectacle. He spoke of arrangements, a nurse during the day if she wished, a gardener to relieve the heavy lifting, a trust to support local domestic staff. "You will have security," he said, "and we will help steward it as you wish." Margaret's laugh that day was small and full of something like joy. "I do not want to be a problem," she said, "but I want to be treated like a person." She did not ask for mansions to be dismantled or for headlines to be made. She wanted what most of us hope for in the arc of life, to be seen, to be accounted for, to be offered rest. Her small wooden cross rocked on its chain. It had not changed. The black-taped bag sat in a corner, less worn perhaps in the way that memory softens edges. The household recalibrated. Veronica learned how to apologize with more than words. She learned how to sit quietly while Margaret told stories of a small, faded yellow house and of making a foam mattress seem like a fortress. She listened as one learns to listen when what they hear is not an interview, but an invitation to be less certain about the kind of person they want to be. Clara, who had been loud with opinion, became quieter in public and occasionally tender in private. The staff, small, practical constellations of people, began to receive wages that reflected more than habit. Gabriel established a fund in Margaret's name to provide training and emergency support to domestic workers in the city, an idea that grew from his mother's insistence that dignity be given to others, not because of pity, but because it was owed. There were days when the house felt like a place of work again, but the nature of the work shifted. Teacups were still made, linen still folded, meals still prepared. What changed was that the hands that moved through the rooms did not have to bend under the weight of pretend invisibility. There were concrete gestures, a day staff nurse who sat with Margaret and read the paper aloud, a gardener who took pride in the flower beds outside the kitchen window, a schedule that allowed Gabriel to be present not as a guest, but as someone rebuilding his life with small, consistent acts. Veronica's change was not immediate or complete. She had to learn that apology required practice, and that pride does not evaporate at the first rain. There were moments of friction, an ill-placed comment at a dinner, an invitation revoked because of gossip. Each was a small test of the new arrangements. Sometimes she stumbled, sometimes she rose with the unglamorous grace of one who is learning a new language. The city watched in small ways. Invitations were rescinded and later reissued with a different tone. People who had once assumed the family's life was flawless began to talk about the human cost of image. Clara, who had once flattered Veronica, became a friend who could press the right kinds of questions. "Are you okay?" she asked, not out of simple curiosity but with honest concern. Veronica, in return, began to answer with a truth that surprised her. Margaret, who had once been pushed into rain, began to take walks that were slow, considerate, and not at the mercy of anyone else's timetable. She visited the faded yellow house in the old neighborhood and sat on the stoop where children still left small piles of smooth stones. The foam mattress there was gone. The house had been sold to a young couple who painted the railings a bright blue. Margaret smiled at the difference and did not dwell on what was lost. She had a small, practical pleasure in the persistence of ordinary things, a kettle that whistled at noon, a napkin folded right, a neighbor who stopped by with a jar of lemon marmalade. One afternoon, Gabriel found her in the small garden behind the mansion, hands in earth that had nothing to do with legal claims. She was planting a little row of thyme, her fingers moving as if they were restitching seams. He came up the path and sat on the bench. For a long time they said nothing, letting the quiet settle like a blessing. Then Gabriel reached into his pocket and drew out the photograph they had both been holding like a talisman. "You were brave," he said, with the kind of simplicity that surprises because it has taken him so long. "You taught me, without saying it, how to keep faith in small things." Margaret looked at him with the steadiness that had been her companion for decades. "I did what mothered me," she said. "I wanted you to go forward. I was afraid of making noise that would hurt you. I thought that would be love." Gabriel swallowed. "It was love. It was also... You were invisible in ways I didn't see." She placed a hand on his. "We can do better," she said. "We can be human." They stayed there until the light softened. The mansion no longer felt like an accusation. It felt, in the small way that houses do, like a site of memory and work. Their lives had not been returned to a fairy tale of perfect closure. There were still difficulties, taxes, trustees' reports, the occasional headline, but the central thing had shifted. Dignity had been reaffirmed not as a charity, but as an expectation. Veronica, in a moment that surprised even herself, invited Margaret to host a small dinner in the house's kitchen. No fanfare, only a group of friends from different parts of life. The meal was simple: soup with bread, a lemon tart that Clara had insisted upon making. Veronica moved through the room in a way that was tentative at first, then steadier, as if learning how to inhabit someone else's story without flattening it. She poured wine for the guests and tea for Margaret, who hugged the cup as if to anchor herself. At the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and the kitchen light burned low, Veronica found Margaret washing a pan by the sink. There was something earnest in her voice that had not been there before. "I want to learn," she said. "Not just how to make the house look right, but how to be right." Margaret looked up and smiled, a kind of patient delight. "You can start by listening," she said, and then, with a small joke that lightened the air, "and not telling the staff when the napkins are off." They laughed, a small, honest sound that marked more than humor. It marked the beginning of a life in which people strove, sometimes clumsily, to be better. Outside, the city went on. The news cycle moved to other things. The Halvorsen mansion remained a house with many rooms and, now, a more complicated heart. The fund Gabriel established in Margaret's name began to accept small donations. Neighbors, staff, even some of the household friends contributed. It would not solve every injustice. It would not erase the years Margaret had worked for too little, or the small humiliations that had accumulated like barnacles. But it would be a practical scaffold, training for domestic workers, emergency grants, a small scholarship to a vocational school. Margaret insisted it be run modestly and with the kind of care that ensured respect. There were quiet gestures that marked repair. Gabriel learned to make tea in the morning, and to bring 2 cups instead of 1, a small tradition he had let go of and now revived. Veronica sat with Margaret on slow Saturdays and listened to stories about the faded yellow house, asking questions as if learning was not a chore, but a delight. Mrs. Peters, who had found the envelope in the hospital, received a note of thanks and a small bonus that reflected gratitude, not in a performative way but as an acknowledgement of the human work she had done. On a soft, clear morning, Margaret and Gabriel sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea. The light fell across the wood. The kettle steamed and exhaled as it always had. They spoke of small things, a repair on the back fence, a neighbor in need, the taste of lemon marmalade left over from Clara's account. Gabriel's voice was steady. He spoke of the legal processes that had been completed, of covenants written and recorded, but mostly he spoke of the way he had learned to love in public, not as a show but as a habit. "I am sorry," he said again, for the particular wrongs and for the accumulated insensitivities that had lain quiet and sore. "I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I hope to be worthy of it in the work I do." Margaret reached for his hand and squeezed it. "You have been given a chance," she said, "to keep doing better. That is what matters." The narrator, watching them there, would note that dignity is a thing made of small, deliberate acts. A morning cup of tea, a listening ear, a legal document handled with care, an apology that is practiced until it becomes truth. The mansion, which once stood as a symbol of unquestioned dominance, had been shown to be a place whose meanings depend on how people within it treat one another. It was not a story about a house being taken from one person and given to another as punishment or triumph. It was, instead, a story about recognition, of the slow justice that comes when paper and memory converge, and when people choose to act with kindness rather than spite. Weeks later, when the city had moved on to other matters, an article appeared, short, factual, about the Halvorsen family's settlement with Margaret Hayes and the establishment of a trust for domestic workers. The headline was smaller than the rumor had been. That was fine. Margaret never wanted headlines. She wanted a kettle that whistled and a place to sit that did not carry the rasp of being unwanted. If you were in Gabriel's place, what would you have done? Share your thoughts below. Would you choose reputation or family? Tell us in the comments. Your voices matter. In the end, no one received vengeance. No one sought spectacle. The law, which moves slowly and with the gravity of ink, had done its patient work. But the real turning, the one that lingered in the house and in the way people moved through its rooms, was quieter still. Hands learning to be gentle, mouths practicing apologies, a family that relearned what to protect. Margaret continued to keep her wooden cross close. The black-taped bag was retired to a drawer where it could rest. The faded yellow house remained a memory she visited, not because she had to, but because she wanted to remember how far things could travel when people chose repair over pride. They drank their tea and watched the light change across the floor. Outside, life continued in its ordinary, complicated way. Inside, there was the steady work of being human, repairing what had been broken, tending what had been neglected, and learning to hold one another in the small, necessary ways that make dignity possible.